Welcome. We're going to talk about Ansible and Windows today and how PowerShell enables Ansible, which is a Linux configuration manager, to work in a Windows world. Before we do that, I know we're nearly finished, but hopefully everybody's visited the sponsors this week. It's really important that the sponsors keep coming back year after year, and it's important you guys just let them know that you appreciate that. That way they sponsor it, we're here next year again. So thank you to them. My name is Paul Broadwith. I'm the Technical Engineering Manager at Chocolatey Software, so one of the sponsors today. There's all my details on the screen, but I'm based in Glasgow in Scotland, and I've got 34 years in IT and just various different things. Primarily in operations and infrastructure, but just prior to joining Chocolatey, I was a PowerShell developer for a couple of different companies. I was a contractor for a couple of different companies for about 3 years. I'm also a Microsoft MVP still. Doesn't change until July, so we'll see what happens. For Cloud and Data Center, primarily for my work in PowerShell as well. This is the Scottish flag. I'm not here to tout Scotland. It's mainly to remind me to tell you that I tend to talk very fast. So if your first language isn't English or you can't keep up with the speed that I'm at, please just give me the old secret slow down signal and I'll repeat myself and slow down. So the agenda for today, we're going to have a quick look at the history of Ansible, just very briefly, 5 minutes or so, where it came from. So if you don't know any about that hopefully will be interesting to you. We're going to look at some Ansible infrastructure, just go over that on the slides and how it kind of hangs together, all the bits and pieces and the components that make it all work. How it works on Windows, perhaps it's PowerShell, which you'll see. We're going to do a demo for about 10 minutes. This is not a demo-heavy presentation, so if you do not like slides, you're probably in the wrong place. So the majority of this is slides. As you can see with that nice little counter down there, there's 27. And then finally, we're going to have questions, hopefully at the end. The schedule's a little bit messed up just now, so I'm hoping we'll get a couple of questions, but if we don't get to your question or we don't get to questions, you can see me in the lobby, or as I said, my details are on that kind of initial slide, and also at the very end, my details are on there as well. So please, let's keep questions to the end, just so we get through all of this. It's not because I don't want to take questions during it, it's just to make sure we get through all the material. So the too long didn't read history of Ansible. So Ansible was first written in 2012, and the first code was put down by Michael DeHaan, who worked at Red Hat and Puppet. So Michael worked on a couple of products at Red Hat called Cobbler and Funk, which is the Fedora Unified Network Controller. I'm glad I remembered that. And he also worked on Puppet at Puppet as well. So he took the learnings of both of those companies and he put together Ansible. And that was when the code was first written 13 years ago, just over 13 years ago. Then we moved to March 2013, just a year later, and Ansible Works Inc. was born. So it wasn't called Ansible to begin with, it was called Ansible Works. That was a company that was wrapped around the product, and it was Michael and a couple of other people whose names escape me. I'm not very good with names. That's why Michael's is written down on the slide. They created that company, and in January 2014, Ansible was born, Ansible as we know it, because Ansible Works Inc. was renamed to Ansible Inc. Then in August 2014, for Windows users, Ansible 1.7 was released with Windows beta support. So we just jump back to the previous slide. February 2012 was when the first code was written. 2.5 years later, we have Windows support being added in. So that was 11 years ago, just under 11 years ago, that Windows support was added in. So it's clear that Windows is important to Ansible. Even though it's a Linux configuration manager, Windows is important. So we'd written it all that time ago and added it in. And then in October 2015, Red Hat buys Ansible. So that kind of came full circle because, as I've mentioned previously, Michael worked at Red Hat. They bought it for $150 million, and then IBM comes along with massive wallet and buys the whole thing for $34 billion, including Ansible itself. So that's the kind of very quick history of where Ansible came from. Now, the word Ansible itself was first coined in 1966 in a book called Ricannon's World. I promise you this is a PowerShell presentation. It's not all about sci-fi and where some particular product came from. But the actual term itself interested me because it wasn't something I knew about. And as I was kind of researching the talk, it became apparent that this was a thing that a lot of people are interested in. So Buchanan's world is where it was first used, and it means answerable device or instantaneous communication systems. I'm not sure if you've ever been on the internet, but apparently people have lots of opinions, and some people's opinions are that that's not where it came from. It was in another book called Ender's World. I haven't read either of them because 1960s sci-fi is not my thing, but it was coined in Buchanan's world, but it was fleshed out in other books. So there you go, a bit of an education while you're here. So Ansible infrastructure itself, how does it all work? How does it hang together? So in the middle there, hopefully you can see that, the Ansible control node is running on Linux, and it only runs on Linux. We'll talk about it in a couple of slides. But the important part inside that box is the configuration itself and the components that make up the Ansible configuration. So we've got Ansible Galaxy at the top, we've got playbooks, plugins, modules and roles, and then at the bottom we've got the inventory itself. We'll just run through it starting from the middle. Playbooks, if you've not used Ansible, are basically your instructions, what you're telling Ansible to assert onto the host device. Okay, you want this state, please put it onto this host device. That's what your playbook is in effect. Plugins extend Ansible itself, and they run on the control nodes. They're written in Python. So being a Linux configuration manager, everything is written in Python and YAML. So because plugins run on that control node on the Linux machine, it needs to be written in Python. There's also modules, which are like plugins, but they run on the host device. So they run on whatever the host device supports. So in the case of Linux, it will be Python. In the case of Windows, as you could probably guess, it's PowerShell. There has been attempts to make Python run on Windows and PowerShell to run on Linux. It's not officially supported. Like a lot of the things we'll talk about in this presentation today, we're talking about officially supported things. So people have got both of those running, Python on Windows and PowerShell on Linux, but it's not officially supported, so your mileage may vary. But apparently it does work, perhaps to a limited extent. Then you've got roles, which kind of really ties it all together. Roles kind of things like variables and files and modules and all the bits and pieces to bring it together. The example I normally use is if you think about a web host role is could have IIS on there, maybe you're configuring the app pool, maybe you've got some storage, maybe you want to configure the firewall, some files, whatever it happens to be. And you can say, that's the configuration I want, here's all the things that make it work. And you tile that up into a role and say, that is a web host role. And you don't have to keep writing that config. You can just say, those 100 machines, they're all web hosts. And that configuration will be applied or asserted onto that device. If we go down to the bottom there, inventory. So we've got static and dynamic inventories. Inventories are kind of what makes everything work in the sense that this is your machines, this is your computers or hosts, as Ansible defines them as. You've got to define what those hosts are. Is it a Windows machine? Is it a Linux machine? How do I communicate to it? Is there any username and password if you happen to be using that? Not recommended in production, but you can do that. And maybe some other things as well, certificates or something that makes that host unique. You can define there in that inventory file. It can be very simple or it can get very complex. It just depends which way you want to go. So that's like a static inventory, something that you define, okay? And you've got that in a file somewhere, that's it. And it just reads off that file. If you want to add another host, you just update that file. There's also something called dynamic inventories, which allows you to pull from maybe Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, some cloud provider, whether it's AWS, Azure, wherever. But if you've got the storage of your hosts somewhere else, CMDB being the example on the slides, you can actually pull that information in, put it in a format that Ansible will understand, YAML as I mentioned, and then Ansible can pick that up and then use that instead. But you have to do that conversion and that pulling of the information. However, if you're using a tool like AWX or Ansible Automation Platform, AWX is a kind of free version of the web portal for Ansible. So you can go in and point and click and see things, get reports. But you can also set up dynamic configurations that will actually run and do all that pulling of information, converting it and doing all the thing for you, and then popping it into the inventory so that you can see that. But you can do that on a cadence, 6, 12, whatever hours you want to do that. You might just want to do it when you're running your playbooks. So if you're the web host example, if you've got 100 web hosts and you want to apply that configuration once a day before you run that playbook, Perhaps you want to pull in the dynamic inventory, see if you've added any more web hosts. Perhaps you're spinning them up and load balancing them, and all this stuff is happening. They're all changing, so you can get that dynamic inventory to happen before the playbook is even run. And then if you've suddenly got 101 web hosts, that new web host will get that configuration as well. So finally, the bit at the very top is probably easy for us to understand. It's basically PowerShell Gallery for Ansible. So PowerShell Gallery's got modules and scripts. Ansible Gallery's got roles, plugins, modules, and collections. We've talked about those underneath. Collections are just basically another grouping of various different things for Ansible. But you can pull all them down from that community site, and that way you can use all of that in your playbooks itself. So again, you can do that with AWX or Ansible Automation Platform on a cadence. You can just do it from the command line. When we're looking at the stuff later on in this presentation, I'm just going to do things from the command line. So you can do that as well. You can add things into what's called a requirements file and tell Ansible, here's all my requirements, what I need, all my collections, all bits and pieces. Go away and make it happen. And it will pull all of that stuff down and put it in the right place. So there we've got Ansible configuration on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side we've got just 4 host devices, but 4 types of host devices. As you'd notice there, they're all agentless. Ansible does not use agent software, so you can, a freshly spun up device doesn't need anything else on it for Ansible to work. As long as it can communicate with it, that's all that's needed. So just at the top there, Linux hosts, you communicate via SSH, as you probably imagine. That is the default. If you don't tell Ansible anything, it's going to assume it's a Linux host and it communicates over SSH. For Windows hosts, you can use WinRM or OpenSSH. I gave this talk 3 years ago. A lot's changed in the Ansible world since then. And at that time, OpenSSH support had been added, but it wasn't officially supported. It was kind of, here's the alpha bits that we've got, try and see if you can get it to work. It now works in version 2.18. In fact, the demo I'm going to show uses OpenSSH and doesn't use WinRM anymore. And you'll see from the host file I showed you, I've commented all that stuff out, left it in so we could see it, but it's now communicating over OpenSSH. And it's really simple and really straightforward to use. I didn't want to just change my demo 2 days ago in case everything broke, but it worked and it was fairly successful. So there are some caveats round about WinRM and OpenSSH if you're using it with Ansible. That's all documented. I'm not going to dig into all of it, but double hop is problematic. OpenSSH requires you to have the OpenSSH package installed. However, officially supported is Windows Server 2022 and nothing else, because you need OpenSSH version 7.9.0.0, which comes out of the box on Windows Server 2022. So that's not saying none of the other ones will work, but that's all it's officially supported. So you should maybe give that a go. I'm using a Windows Server 2022 box in the demo, so that's how it works. And all you need to do is you just configure OpenSSH as you would imagine. In my case, I'm using username and password authentication, but you can use key authentication and GSS API configuration, authentication, as well. I haven't tried either of those. As I said, I only done this a couple of days ago. I wanted to do the easy one that I knew worked rather than start digging into other stuff. But it works really well. It works really well. It's actually faster. It feels faster to me than using WinRM, but your mileage may vary. Then we've got networking devices. So Ansible can actually assert this configuration onto network devices. So using something like a Cisco device or a Juniper device, a switch router, that kind of thing, it will assert the configuration onto that as well. And it uses whatever it requires to communicate with, SSH or APIs. It's on the screen there. Finally, you've got cloud services. This is the interesting bit for me with Ansible. So if you're using like Azure or AWS or GCP or whatever you're using, Ansible will communicate through the API and do its stuff, whatever it is you require it to do. The good thing for Ansible, for me, is that Ansible does everything. So traditionally, you would use a tool to provision your infrastructure. I know a lot of people use Terraform or Tofu. Provision your network load balancers, storage, networking, VMs, etc., etc. So you would spin all of that up, and then you'd use a configuration manager tool, maybe Puppet or Ansible or Chef or something else, to assert the configuration onto the virtual machines. Ansible will do all of it. It will spin up all of your cloud infrastructure, wait until your VMs are actually provisioned and ready, and then provision your VMs as well. So you only need one tool. You only need to understand one tool and how it works, how to troubleshoot it, where all the bits are. You don't need to try and understand the complexities of two tools. So that, for me, is the huge benefit of it. So how does Ansible work on Windows? Bear in mind, Ansible is a Linux configuration manager. So Ansible is the following requirements for Windows hosts. Again, you're looking at it going, well, other stuff is still alive, and why is it not supported? This is what's officially supported. So Ansible works with the Microsoft lifecycle. So whatever Microsoft has stopped supporting or deprecated, the Ansible won't test on anymore. So it's tested on Windows Server 2016 and Windows 10. Well, Windows 10 end of lives in October this year. No doubt it will move to Windows 11 that they will support. PowerShell 5.1 is the minimum they support as well. So if you're writing your Windows PowerShell modules, you'll need to take that into account. But when I gave this talk, again, 3 years ago, the minimum requirements were Windows Server 2012, Windows 8.1, and PowerShell 3 and .NET 4. So I don't imagine the entire Windows collection, Ansible Windows collection, has been rewritten for Windows PowerShell 5.1. So your mileage, again, will vary. Maybe you can run it and it'll work on Windows 7 if you've happened to have any of those lying about. But, the minimum requirements are what's officially supported. Obviously, if you're using WinRM or OpenSSH, then that needs to be configured and listening as well. So I mentioned a couple of slides ago, the Ansible control node cannot run on Windows natively. Okay, this isn't they just haven't tried it. They have tried it, it doesn't work. There's a person called Matt Davis who worked at Ansible. I don't know if he still works there, but he did work there. And he took the Ansible code base and he moved it to Windows and tried to tweak it and get it to work. And his results from that were that there was too many Unixisms, that's his word, in Ansible in order for it to work on Windows. The code base would need to be entirely rewritten for it to happen on Windows. So it's not going to happen anytime soon, if at all. So your options are not running it on Windows. But there are other options. You can run it on the Windows subsystem for Linux. Again, when I gave this talk 3 years ago, that's what I used. I used Windows subsystem for Linux to communicate with my Windows laptop and do the work there. It works really well. You can use a Linux virtual machine. Spin it up in Hyper-V or VMware Workstation or your hypervisor of choice. And Ansible has certain supported operating systems. So you would imagine being a Red Hat product that they purchased all that way back 2015. Their flavors of Linux are kind of supported with the package manager. So I'm actually running Fedora 41 on my laptop, and that is Red Hat or IBM operating system there. So I can use the package manager to install it. Debian is also supported, so you can use the package manager for that. There's probably another couple of them that are supported as well. I can't remember all the ones off the top of my head. However, you can, for all of them, use Python's pip package manager to install Ansible and get it up and running. So if you want to use Arch, something that I know is definitely not supported officially, you could just run it through, run Python pip command and install Ansible that way. So there are many options that you've got to get it to work on Windows, but just not natively. There is a plethora of Ansible Docker containers on Docker Hub as well. All slightly different. This has been tweaked for that, etc., etc. So that again is another option for you. And finally, I don't know if anybody uses or even knows what Cygwin is. It's sort of like a bash shell that sits on top of Windows. It's been around for a very long time. Some people have had success getting Ansible to run on top of it. I would imagine it's probably a certain subset of Ansible rather than the whole thing for everything, and it's very fantastic, but it's not officially supported. But again, your mileage may vary, maybe it'll work for you. But whatever you decide to use, you need, here's the kind of requirements. So when Ansible release a new version, I think 2.18.3 is the latest, but 2.18 is the kind of minor version, and it was released in November last year. And when that was released, Python 3.13 was the latest available version of Python. So what Ansible have decided they will do is they support 3 versions of Python. They'll support the current one when the product is released, and they'll support the 2 previous ones to that. So in this case, 3.11, 3.1.2 and 3.1.3. The previous version of Ansible, 3.1.12 was the latest, so it was 3.1.12, 3.1.11 and 3.10. You get the idea. So if you install the latest all the time, you don't really need to worry about that. The PyWinRM module, if you're using WinRM to communicate with your Windows devices, that is also required. So you'll need to install that with the Python pip, regardless of how you install Ansible itself. It's not installed out of the box, and there's a minimum version of 0300. I think it's very old, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But if your WinRM's not working, it might be something just to check. And finally, for this demo, I'm using SSH password authentication, as I said. And I didn't realize you needed this particular package. So Ansible was very helpful, saying I can't communicate. You're using username and password authentication. You'll need to install this package. So again, you will need that if you're using password authentication, username and password authentication. Not recommended for production, but again, it works. So we're actually really ahead of time. I'm very surprised because I usually take an awful lot longer to go through this. So write your first Ansible module. All of this is documented on the Ansible website. So if you're wanting to get more information, as you will, that's actually a really good place to start. The Ansible documentation is really, really good for all of it. But the Windows stuff is really good as well. So I would suggest you go and look at that. But this is the kind of compact version. So the code, as you'd imagine, is in the PowerShell script. Okay, the documentation is in the Python script. If you've ever, we'll have a look at it quickly. We'll have a look at the documentation. If you've ever used comment-based help in PowerShell, it's the same thing, just in an entirely different format. So you've got things like the description of your parameters, values that they can accept, examples for how to use your module, return results, that kind of thing. So that's all in there, as I said, just in a different format. The documentation is also not required. I haven't written any documentation for the demo module that I've created for this talk. Don't use write host debug verbose and error is what they say. A lot of modules do use it because you can actually parse the output in your playbooks. One of the ones that came up recently was when you install Hyper-V, the Hyper-V role on Windows, it will actually tell you if it requires a reboot or not in the output, and you can actually grab that output and determine whether you reboot in your playbook, you reboot the server or not just from that output. So don't use that stuff officially, but a lot of things do. And as I said, it can be useful. But there should be another way to detect if a reboot is required, but unfortunately, the way it's been done is to just check the output that comes back from the thing you're doing. Exceptions and errors can be returned back to Ansible. We'll actually see in the demo, we just throw an exception. You can see Ansible, actually, it comes right through into Ansible into the output. So that can be useful as well if something is really broken. You can also specify your minimum PowerShell or operating system requirements. So as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, PowerShell 5.1 is the minimum version officially supported, but let's say you need PowerShell 7 or Windows 11 or something else. You can actually specify that in your module as well. We don't dig into that here. Again, the documentation gives you much more information. And finally, modules are actually run under strict mode version 2. So if you're debugging your Windows PowerShell module, make sure that you're doing that so you're comparing apples with apples and it becomes clear as to why things may not be working. Okay, so we're just going to do a quick demo and I'm going to take you through, there we go. Is that clear for everybody? Yeah? Sorry? I actually had it in a light mode and I thought if I put it in light mode it's going to blind everybody because all the slides are really dark. Do we want to put it in a light mode? I'm easy either way. Okay, let's put it in light mode then. There we go. Hopefully everybody's eyes cope with that. So first thing I'm going to do is have a look at the Ansible. So hopefully you can see on the left-hand side, that's how the Ansible.Windows module is there. Collection is there. And you can see there's a lot of these folders on the left-hand side. It's actually in a hierarchical structure. Okay, and this is the way Ansible expects these things to be. And modules are under plugins and then modules. And the first one we're actually going to look at is something called WinPing. So There we go. This always comes up. If you look at the Linux version of a lot of these modules, so for example, there's a ping module for Linux, okay? All of the Windows ones are called win underscore. And it's just a tradition that's used. So there may not be an equivalent Linux one, but your Windows one should really be called win underscore. And all it is there for is to differentiate between if it's a Windows module and a Linux one. That's all it's really for. It's just, again, one of those traditions, one of those things that they do. And what's important is, and I'll do this, you'll see that the module I've written is very, very simple. And you'll think, the whole talk for this really simple module. That's the actual point. This is really simple. It's not complicated. It's a kind of scary thing when you're thinking it's a Linux configuration manager, how it's going to, it's really straightforward. So anyway, this line's required here. All that's telling Ansible is I want to import this thing so I can create an Ansible object, and we'll see it in just a second. Then we tend to create this hash table here, and again, traditionally it's called spec, which is one of those things. And inside that, the important bit there is inside options, and data is actually a parameter we can pass to this module. And you can see that, again, I don't really need to explain, it's really straightforward. Let me get rid of this. The type is string, it's just a string, and the default is POM. It's that straightforward. And then down here, sorry, my touchpad has been funny. We create a module, an object, okay, that Ansible requires. And then here's your PowerShell code, your actual thing that does the job. If data equals crash, throw an exception. Otherwise, return whatever parameter I've passed back to it. So that's data there. And then the really important part is this, exit JSON. That just kind of finishes your Windows PowerShell module. And you'll see all of the ones that we're going to look at, some of them have a little bit more in the header, but they're all the same thing. Here's the bits at the top, here's the bit at the bottom, here's your PowerShell code in the middle that does the work. So that's straightforward, hopefully. I'll show you the documentation. What have we got left? 17 minutes. Again, documentation, as I said, it's a bit like that comment-based help we use in PowerShell. At the top there, we've got the module name, a description. We've got, they call them options, they're basically parameters. Data, what's the description of that type, default value. You've got things like the notes underneath, like we have in PowerShell. You've got see also and author. And then further down, we've got examples, how you use it. And then you've got what it returns. Straightforward, just different format to what we're used to in PowerShell. There we go. So I'm going to go back to the top here, sorry. And we're going to look at just a slightly different one, which is the, I can't spell, environment one. There we go. Windows environment. The reason just showing you this is it's more complicated or more complex. It's not complicated, but it's exactly the same. So we just scroll to the top. We've got the Ansible basic again in here, this line, okay? We've got another line here, add type, because we're going to do something slightly different in here, but we've still got the Ansible basic one, because that's the important one. We've got the parameters there, that's spec. A lot more parameters this time. As you can see, they're all strings with the exception of variables. You've got choices, machine, present, user, or absent and present. So that's all I can pick. If I pick something else, it'll error. You've got mutually exclusive there, which is a bit like your PowerShell parameter sets. You're saying, I want this one, but not that one. Same sort of thing. And then you've got that object again, the Ansible object. Oh, here we go again. Just there. Again, just like the other one. So WinPing, really straightforward, really simple. That's much more complex, but it's the same things we're doing here. And then you've got a whole set of PowerShell code doing lots of different things. I'm not going to dig into it. But do you remember I showed you at the very top, I had the add type in there. That's so that we can do this. Oh. Basically do that and do more things, okay? And then at the very bottom, take a guess what's there, exit JSON. So it's just returning JSON back to Ansible, which Ansible will then interpret, do what it needs to do with it, tell you, as a user, it'll act on that information. Has something changed? Okay, I'm going to tell you it's changed. Is there something else? Is there output there? Let me show that in the logs, that kind of stuff. So again, much more complex, but still those same building blocks, these really simple building blocks that they have. There's one more I want to just show. Again, just kind of builds on it a little bit more, is the chocolatey Ansible collection. And again, it's the same folder structure, modules. I'm just going to grab the first one because I'm not going to dig into it in any great detail. What I just want to show you is, again, we've got Ansible Basic there. We've got some requires lines here, just the normal PowerShell requires lines. In here as well, we've got a few more things Ansible requires. I'm just going to scroll to the, actually, let me get rid of that. So we've got there, it wants module utils common and config. I'll show them in a second. And again, if we just scroll to the bottom, we've got exit.json there again. So those common and config are actually in a module utils folder there, and it's just PowerShell. It's just saying bring them in. So you can see that, although they do lots of different things, the building blocks are all the same. I'll show mine in a minute. Very, very simple. What have we got left? There we go. I want to show you a host file. Again, straightforward. That's just a normal host file there. Nothing fancy about it. This is a virtual machine running on my machine, so it's not DNS resolvable, which is why I've got to put in the IP address. You might not need that if you've got proper DNS infrastructure. I'm just telling it the Ansible connection type is SSH, and to use PowerShell as the shell type. Previously, when it was WinRM, you can see all of this stuff in here about using WinRM as opposed to SSH and the different transport and ports and all that other stuff. That's just what you would use for WinRM. So that's very basic host file. I mentioned the requirements file. I've just put in there collections Ansible.Windows. Remember I was saying you can bring all these collections down and do all this fancy stuff. You can pull things in from Git, you can pull it from the Ansible Galaxy, you can pull it from here. That's would go in your requirements file, and all you're saying to Ansible is, please bring all this stuff down so I can assert this configuration, because it's all needed. There's two versions of Ansible you can install, Ansible Core and Ansible is the names. Ansible Core doesn't include much at all, and that's what I've got installed, which is why I've had to install the Ansible.Windows collection. If I'd installed Ansible, it would already have been installed as part of that. So you might not need that for yours, depending on what you install. Okay, so I mentioned WinPing. All it does is it asserts, or I keep saying asserts, all it does is determines it can communicate with the host. This is always a scary bit, but I did check this earlier and it works. And there you go. That's all this is saying here is run the WinPing module, connect to demo host. My host file is in hosts, and there's the Ansible username and password that's I've imported into the session. And down here, the result is changed, false, because we haven't changed anything, and ping and pong, because remember that default value was pong for the WinPing one. But you can have any data returned, and so here we're going to say return demo instead, so it's ping demo. And finally, I showed you about the code that said if the data's crash, then throw an exception. So here we can see an exception being thrown. And there it's there. Unhandled exception while executing module, boom, because that's what it returns, boom. So you can see how you can pass data to modules. You can see as well how you can throw exceptions and get that output back. And Ansible will stop because the exception has been thrown. You can configure it to do different things, but that's what we're doing here. So I want to just show the playbook for this demo as well. Again, just incredibly simple. Just the name of the task, right? Fully qualified name to the module. That tends to be recommended now. In the past, I could just have put win_demo file, and when Wayne found it, they recommend you use the fully qualified name of the module. The name is demo_test. That's important because when we go and look at the code, you'll see that demo_test is actually the file we want to create. And then we're saying, to begin with, the state is absent. I don't want that file there. Assert that configuration. If it's there, remove it. If it's not there, don't do anything. So let's have a look at the code itself. And you can see how simple the code actually is. Let me scroll up. So again, that building block, the Ansible basic, it's there. We've then got spec with the hash tables and the parameters. So we've got name, it's just a string, and that's the name of the file we're going to use. And in state, I've said here, the choices are absent or present, don't accept anything else. It can either be there or it cannot be there. We create that object again just there, like we've done elsewhere. I've hard-coded a path in. Obviously, you wouldn't do that. But all I'm saying is that's the folder I want to put this file in, is C:\Ansible-demo. The file path is just that plus the name. So in this case, the one we're doing is demo_test. Create a folder if it doesn't exist. That's all we're doing here. But one of the important things I wanted to point out here is this out null. So when I talked earlier on about make sure your right host, verbose debug, all those things, don't use them because they pollute the output stream. So does doing new item. It returns an object that pollutes the output stream. So just pipe it to out null. Oh, come on. There we go. And what we're saying here is if the folder path exists and the state is absent, just remove the file. That makes sense. I've said, please don't have that file there. Remove the file. The important thing is here, we're saying result changed equals true. So we're telling Ansible something has changed, I've changed something. So you can return that information to Ansible. And you're saying there, if state is present, if the file is present, if I've said the state is present and the file isn't present, create it. And say again, I have changed something and tell Ansible that. And then we've just got exit.json. It's not exit.json, exit.json at the end. So incredibly simple. So let's execute the playbook. So we've said, the playbook says, let's just open it again. We're saying absent. So we don't want a file there. I want to show you the virtual machine just to confirm there is no file there. So we're looking at the on the C drive Ansible-demo. It's not there, as you can see. So we run that. Ansible goes away, does its thing, and comes back. And these are the important bits here. We've said, OK equals 1 means I have run this and it was fine. There was no errors. Everything was great. And changed equals 0. Nothing's changed because we've said it's got to be absent and it's not there. So we've not done anything. So again, that was the result changed equals true. Do you remember we had it as by default as false? So this is the false part. So if we go and change this to present, you could probably guess what's going to happen. So again, we've got OK equals 1 and changed equals 1 because we created something. We changed the state of that host device by adding that file in. And if we go and have a look, we can see Ansible demos being created and demo_test is there. So if we run that again, we've said present again, playbook's not changed. It'll say OK equals 1, changed equals, we haven't changed anything. So that code path again didn't go in and do anything. And then finally, let's change it back to absent and you can guess what's going to happen. OK equals 1, changed equals 1. Again, we've changed the state of the end device. And if we go into the VM, we'll see that the folder still exists because you remember the code, I didn't say remove the folder. I said just remove the file, which is gone. Okay, so if you were going to do something similar, obviously this is a very basic demo, you'd maybe remove that folder. And that, believe it or not, is the very simple demo. So just as a summary, we know about the too long didn't read history of Ansible, where it came from, February 2012 it was written, right through to 2019 when IBM came along with big wallets and bought it. We understand Ansible infrastructure, all the components, how it all hangs together, how it works. We know how Ansible works on Windows and how it does not run as a control node on Windows. Remember that it can't run on Windows natively, but you have those options of virtual machine, Windows subsystem for Linux, Docker containers, and potentially Cygwin if you want to try that. It's not supported. And we know how Windows Ansible modules are structured. Do you remember the folder structure I had? That is important. There's also other things in there like files that tell it various things, but you know we're keeping this very high level. So any questions? We have 5 minutes left if my timing is correct. This was incredibly simple, so I'm not really expecting any questions. Yes?
Hey, you said something early on I was surprised to hear you say. I heard you say that Ansible cares about Windows.
Ansible?
Cares about Windows.
Yes.
So we have found that not to be true in our interactions with Red Hat.
Okay.
And a couple of coworkers went to Ansible Fest last year. What they found out is that Red Hat has one developer working part-time on the official Ansible modules.
Okay.
The Windows ones.
Yeah, the Windows ones.
I mean, what have you seen that makes you say that Ansible cares about Windows?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, Ansible cared about Windows back in 2014 when they added that support in, after 2.5 years of starting it. I always, the community round about the Windows part of Ansible is always been quite active, I've found. A lot of people use Ansible on Windows. A lot of people also don't know it will work on Windows for some reason. I was at Ansible, not last year, it was many years ago, it was Ansible Fest, and talking to people about Ansible on Windows. Being from Chocolatey, we have a Chocolatey collection. It was a surprise to people. So I understand where you're coming from. And it could be the Red Hat IBM influence in that they are very much not focused on Windows. They also want to, obviously being companies that are large wallets, as I said, both of them were, they will want to monetize Ansible as much as they can. Yeah, they've got, exactly. So they want to monetize. You've got the Ansible automation platform as well, which is, it's not cheap to use, but it also fits into all their other infrastructure. So they will want to make as much money out of it as possible. If people are using it for Red Hat estates, Red Hat Linux estates, enterprise Linux estates, then I can see why they wouldn't put much effort in. But I've always seen that the Ansible community have been really active. And it's as I kind of showed there, it's really straightforward to write your own. And that Ansible.Windows collection is is a staple of running it on Windows. So yeah, but back in 2014, the heart was there, and it's probably been bought out of them all. And yeah, it'll come down to money. But disappointing to hear that you found that experience as well. Anybody else got any questions? Well, we finished 2 minutes early. Okay. There is the QR code. Please leave feedback. I'm very interested to know what you guys think. Please be kind. You can be critical and kind. It's easy. There is also the URL at the bottom there where you'll find this talk online probably tomorrow. The code will go up when I get back to Scotland at the weekend. And also, very quickly, if you go online, you will also find a resources section. I'm not going to dig into it just now, but you'll find that I've given a lot of resources of where you can find more information and where I've got information for this talk as well. Okay, so thank you very much.